I'm going to talk about the contents of one chapter from the book, just as a taste of the book. But I've put the address of the companion website there. It's guitarguide.com with the letters YM before for Yehudi Menuhin, because this book is part of the Yehudi Menuhin music guides. And round about 1980, Yehudi Menuhin commissioned a series of books, one for each instrument, and wrote a beautiful kind of instruction for such a book, that the book would not be a method, but a book that would simply stimulate young musicians. And he wrote the book on violin, and some of his colleagues at the time wrote the other books, and especially people who were teaching at the Yehudi Menuhin School of Music, which is a school that Menuhin founded, again, to stimulate young minds. It's a high school in liceo, where young musicians can go and do their schooling as young people, but get a very intensive education in music. And somewhere, you have these books on piano, violin, flute, and so on, percussion, cello, really wonderful books. They all came out in the 80s and 90s. Somewhere on one of them, it mentions that there will be a book for the guitar. And who was going to write this book but Narciso Yepes? What an incredible book that would have been for those of you who are familiar with that very strange, extraordinary, unique artist. I have no idea what that book would have been, but it never got written. And instead, we had to wait until 2024 when the publishers decided to add guitar to the list, to the catalogue. And this was written by me and my colleague, Richard Wright, who is the guitar instructor at the Yehudi Menuhin School of Music. So that's what the book is. It's a book that is simply intended to stimulate, to encourage, and certainly in the parts that I wrote, I thought a lot about not only what to say, but how to say it and what not to say, so that people are able to go through the text and go through the musical examples and make their own discoveries. So there's something about not saying, here is the discovery you're about to make, but look at this. And then there's some ideas that are given, but it's possible for people to have their own adventure in the book. That's my hope, anyway. At the very end of the book, there is a chapter on collaborating with composers, meaning composers who don't play the guitar. And there, well, many years ago, I wrote a small set of notes for composers to read who want to write for the guitar. In this book, I decided to write something to encourage the youngest players to begin that journey of collaborating with composers as early as possible. And the chapter is very much about working with people with whom you feel comfortable, perhaps people at the same stage of their career as you, so that you can learn how not to treat the composer as a kind of someone far superior who knows everything about music, which often leads to a very bad collaboration in which the guitarist is unable to really ask honestly for things and really tell the composer honestly if the piece is going to be played by other guitarists because it is grateful and attractive to play on the instrument. So rather than continuing on that line, let me immediately show you some case studies that I included in the book that are from my own experience with composers who I think never thought they would write for the guitar. I'm going to speak about an Indian composer called Param Vir, and two British composers, Harrison Birtwistle, one of the great British avant-garde composers, and Roxanna Panufnik, a British composer very much in demand for her work in opera, chamber music, and choir. But I want to give one preliminary about what I think is almost the most important thing to look for when working with a composer. A lot of pieces, let's try out the guitar. A lot of contemporary guitar pieces go like this, something like this. Interesting chords, incisive passage work, virtuosic, exciting, but something is missing. And what's missing is resonance. So by resonance, I don't necessarily mean that we write a chord like this, which has a great resonance, or that the single lines it's possible for a single line to have a beautiful resonance. It's possible for a chord to have a beautiful resonance. But this is not quite what I'm talking about. If you look at a guitar piece and all you ever see are single lines and chords, almost certainly the piece will somehow not work the way you hoped. Because to my mind, the essence of the guitar's resonance is the sound you get when one note has been plucked and is ringing and dying away, and then we add something, a new pluck against it. So it's the combination of the guitar's attack and the guitar's sustain. We can somehow the guitar needs to do that. Create this mixture of attacks. As soon as we learn how to do that idiomatically, you'll notice from just that messing about that immediately the guitar's techniques start to work for you, things like harmonics. So in a piece, for example, like Elliott Carter's Changes for guitar, very forbidding piece for the guitar. There is plenty of the writing that I spoke about earlier, the incisive, always vertical writing. So there's a lot of that, but there's also a lot of this. So beautiful because of the way the resonance, the sustain, and the attacks all work together. And as soon as Carter starts to think that way, immediately you notice how he starts to draw on the aspects of the guitar that give us that kind of sustain. So composers, they're allowed to do plenty of but I think that our job as guitarists is to try to convince them to do this kind of thing as well, right? Takemitsu, Equinox. We see, it looks very dark. Is that the setting on my computer, perhaps? Could be. Can we see okay, more or less? It's probably worth... Well, in a moment, I might check the brightness of... Do you think, Giovanni, the brightness of my own computer would affect? Possible. It's okay, all right. I don't want to retune my guitar to try to play that for you, or I'll be tuning for an hour. But you can see very much how Takemitsu is doing the kind of thing I was just demonstrating. creating chords, letting them ring while something else happens. You could say that the natural idiom of the guitar is to move from one string to another in order for the resonance to happen. But it's good if it goes beyond arpeggios into chords mixed with arpeggios, this kind of thing. And then vertical elements like the end, the chords there, are very welcome and very beautiful. So that's one thing. Another thing that composers often struggle with is the range of the instrument, right? Because if you're writing for the piano or the orchestra, as composers often are, they might start with, they might have things like this, and then they have, they have a special low register that is available at certain moments, but isn't really available on the guitar. How many guitar pieces start, with right away with our lowest note? In the same way that, violin pieces, like Bach's First Violin Sonata, often immediately announce the lowest part of the instrument. For some composers, that's a problem. And one of the ways they can be encouraged to think is to nonetheless treat the lowest register of the guitar as not always present. So for example, in this saw example behind me, you can imagine a version that goes but that's not the way Saw writes. He deliberately, for the first downbeat, and then the bass comes, and then when we hear that low E, it sounds so special, right, in the context. Nevertheless, bum-ba-dum, with nothing, lam-ba-dum, with no bass note, and then still with no bass. And which means that when in the second part we finally get a bass note under this gesture, and more sorry, the lights are so I would say that low E sounds an octave lower than it really is, precisely because of the way Saw earns the right to this note, right? Then comes another. The still bass. Then the bass goes away. Then the bass. Almost any page of Saw could demonstrate this very sensitive handling of the bass that perhaps comes a little bit out of his technique, where the thumb was often being used close to the strings. But nevertheless, it's a real lesson in how to handle the tessitura of the guitar. Examples such as Bach's Lute Suite, BWV 995, or the Fifth Cello Suite, show just how little is required to get that resonance of the instrument compared with, say, writing for solo cello. Another thing that composers need to be encouraged to think about, particularly if they're very interested in the technicalities of the instrument, is that the guitar is often at its best when it's suggesting something greater than itself. In this example, from the end of Benjamin Britten's Nocturnal, we have a transcription of a song, so voice and lute together. I think almost everyone in this room will know this. The original song, Come heavy sleep, so on. And on the guitar, these notes. The sung part doesn't sustain, and very often it can't sustain because we don't have enough fingers. But by resources such as letting the note speak for a moment before continuing, we create an illusion that is fragile, yes, but all the more magical for that. And so, in a way, composers will need to be encouraged, shown examples of the guitar as an instrument of illusion, as an instrument of the imagination. So now let me turn to these three case studies. I'm going to talk about Param Vir first. Now, Param Vir lives in England, but he was born in New Delhi, India. He became a musician, became a composer, and his first experiences of composing were writing musicals. I don't know if that word is immediately known to you in English, but I mean the kind of show with popular songs in a very accessible style, like Les Miserables, or The Sound of Music. This was the kind of music he was writing, but then he met Leonard Bernstein and then Peter Maxwell Davies, who thought that he had a potential to develop in a more avant-garde way. And that was where he wanted to go. So he got this encouragement and then came to England, studied with Oliver Nusson, and then eventually his preferred genre is that of opera. So here is a composer with some Indian background. His mother was an Indian classical singer, and a liking for the full range of the orchestra, especially in terms of register. Not only that, Param Vir's music is distinguished by often a sense of flux. Not long after writing this piece, he wrote a piece for the great sculpture in the middle of Chicago, the so-called Bean, in which the full orchestra is being used, and at every moment, one instrument in the orchestra, one part of the orchestra, is performing a glissando. So you have these beautiful harmonies, but there's always something sliding between. How to make any of these resources possible on the guitar? This is just one movement from a larger piece that he wrote for me called Clear Light, Magic Body. And this movement starts like this. I'll just check the tune. So the first problem to solve was the harmonies, the wide spacing. And very often when I work with a composer, there's something on my mind also. It makes it easier for the composer if they say, well, okay, how should we start? I'm thinking about what I'm going to do. And you say, well, you know, something I've been interested in recently is this possibility. And then the composer is able to see how they have something fresh and exciting, something not in the pieces that they've encountered. So I was very interested in the possibilities of playing 4-note chords and then using the little finger to pluck an artificial harmonic. Unfortunately, I broke the nail on this finger a couple of days ago, which is why some of them were not very clear, I know. But another time. From there, he immediately had the idea of writing an isorhythmic piece, meaning that he wrote a chord progression, first of all separately, and the idea was that there's a rhythm to that, and then when the chords are used again, the rhythm shifts by one, so the chords take on a slightly different relationship with the rhythm. Those chords were written separately, and then we addressed the issue of how to slide on the guitar. And again, there were two things that were interesting me at the time. One is the possibility on the guitar of using the left hand in a very articulate way. So for example, if I play a G, then add the left hand, there is a consonant there. So the idea was to, first of all, to give a lot more presence to the bass register. I know that it's probably quite subtle in the audience, but nevertheless, I hope something comes across of the, because if I don't pluck, I get, and then just add the right hand. Right away, that brings the attention to the bass register and makes it more possible to tolerate the weakness of the glissandos. And then the other thing that we were interested in was supporting a glissando with a unison. So I go, and then just add quietly, or but sometimes we can do better, or we can make it more interesting, because we can create dissonances. Where these notes sound like almost accidental resonances. So we tried to put all of that together into a version of the, into a sound world for the piece, as you see there, those ideas in place. Let me show you an example of what changes. Sometimes composers write a passage and they know they don't want, this is not what they want, but it's an opening gambit, a proposal. Like this passage, it might be good for me to see it. 1 second. Ah. So here we have the glissandi, very unsupported, and double octaves that the composer wanted to have a very tranquil, calm atmosphere. So Sorry. When the piece was written, we stayed up all night and went through every part of it. And when we got to this part, he said, how can we get more resonance and more mystery into this passage? And I think that my role here was to improvise and to think of things that to me sounded like his music. I knew his operas quite well, so, for example, this gesture, it's possible, first of all, to create that extra resonance with the harmonics, but also to add richness. Some of the glissandos we can add an extra dissonance. And then sometimes other notes are possible to add support to the sonority. So we get these mysterious. Now, every one of those chords, those three-note chords that is produced, or even the two-note chords, all belong to the same harmony, which in post-tonal theory we would call the 0-1-4, a combination of a semitone, a major third, and a minor third, which was, first of all, part of the octatonic sound world of the piece, and secondly, a chord that I had often heard him use, that Param Vir use, in a richly orchestrated way. So it was very easy to find these chords under my fingers, including the, so this was, there's another 0-1-4, 0-1, 0-1-4. This was improvised, but it was in the nature of Param Vir's work that he was always very, very meticulous about the choice of pitches. So, of course, we had to go through the pitches, the rhythms, and everything so that he was sure it had the kind of polish that he wanted it to have. A very different composer is Harrison Birtwistle. Harrison Birtwistle wrote a 15-minute piece, Beyond the White Hand, commissioned by Julian Bream. And I had the opportunity to go and meet with Harrison Birtwistle, go through the piece, and then actually go to Julian Bream's house and listen to Julian Bream making his suggestions for the piece, playing, making sure that it all got to be heard. Now, the thing was, when I got to Harrison Birtwistle's house to play for him, he didn't even any longer have a copy of the score, the partitura. He'd already sent it to the publisher. When he went to Julian Bream's house, he didn't even bring his glasses. All he used was his ears. He knew his piece very well, but if a suggestion came with a new pitch, he simply listened to whether it was his kind of harmony or not. So that was one thing that was very different for me, experiencing a composer who was actually very kind of free, not too worried about the exact meticulous details of every pitch. It was just as long as it sounded right to him. And then the other thing, of course, was listening to Julian Bream giving suggestions, which came like 3 per second. And later on, Julian said to me, some of my suggestions are very bad. I know they are, but I never know until I've heard them. Birtwistle's world, Birtwistle again is a composer very well known for his operas, for works for orchestra, chamber, vocal works, string quartet. And generally, his music has a very rough texture. And it's often connected with a sense of ritual, of like a pre-Christian time. And right away at the beginning of this piece, he starts by connecting very dark intervals on the guitar like this. often actually there's a scale like becomes, right, changing the octave, and then one word that Birtwistle sometimes used when working with Bream was grunge, which is just a kind of rock music, very rough. So sometimes Julian Bream's instincts were to fill in. When he heard something that sounded thin on the guitar, his instinct was to fill it in a kind of a very natural way. For example, a passage like this. Just those three sounds. Julian Bream said, oh, what if we go... which sounds like William Walton, but not like Harrison Birtwistle. So often the resource was to find ways of, again, supporting the sonority. So that things ring in a subtle way, but you get that idea. Now, for some of Birtwistle's sonorities, like the one on the screen behind me, I thought that the exact voicing and the combination of dissonances was very important to be clear. So in a passage like this, we hear somehow like a little plant in the desert. We hear it 3 times, and first... then it develops. Now that's what Birtwistle wrote, right? Very, very precise sounding chords. And with these combinations of tritones, intervals that have a lot in common with fourth or fifths, it sounds very much like the world of the beginning. But Julian Bream immediately suggested adding effects to this passage. So he asked for a tambura. Then here he asked for harmonics, very Julian Bream to ask for harmonics. Oh, sorry. And when I played it for them with the tambura, and I absolutely expected Birtwistle to say, oh, no. My exact sonority, the intervals, it has to be very clear. Instead, he just said, beautiful. It turned out that what I thought was important in his music all the time wasn't important to Birtwistle, and he really enjoyed. It didn't matter to him. I suppose he writes these chords like 500 a day, so it didn't matter to him if some of them are played tambura and not so clear. And he was totally fine with adding extra notes, right? So a chord like this, to be tapped, needs an extra note, so it became... I was so against this idea that when Julian went out of the room to get some more wine, I said, are you sure? Are you sure you like this effect? Yes, absolutely. It's just the kind of thing I was hoping for. So it just goes to show that composers are often very open to a wide range of things, and what you might think is important to them in their language might not be as important as you think. Birtwistle asked me before the meeting, he said, can you help me? Can you help me make the piece sound more like itself? And to him, these effects were more like the music he had in mind. How am I doing for time, Enrica? Because I know we started very late. How much, sorry? 20 minutes? Oh, yeah, we'll do very well then. Let me turn to Roxanna Panufnik. I want to leave time for questions if I can. Roxanna Panufnik, again, is a composer much better known for larger works. Now, she is a composer who takes much pleasure in melody and harmony. And she's said that one of the things that she wants is for her harmonies to glow. To glow. And when she came to write this guitar piece, she wrote it mostly by herself, and then it was checked later. So this particular piece is called Sea Voyage, and it was written about 3 years ago, I think now, and it was first performed by Diogo Carlos, and who was a Portuguese guitarist. And since it was written for a Portuguese guitarist, and Roxanna Panufnik likes to refer to all kinds of different musical cultures in her music. She was a child of a refugee. She thought of writing a guitar piece that takes us from one country to another, but always across the sea on a ship. So we start in Britain, and then we're on our ship, we cross the English Channel. Eventually we get to go to various places. We get to Portugal, we get back on the ship, we go through the Middle East, we get to India in the end, and finish there. So how to make, this is a 15-minute piece, so how to make it unified? She created a lot of unity by putting, first of all, by having one melody that was that is referred to throughout the piece, an old Portuguese lullaby, a Christmas lullaby. And then she wrote a series of sea interludes between each section, passages of journey, that are always based upon the same harmonies. And of course, the harmonies have to glow. One issue, however, was what I said earlier, that she wrote the piece without really collaborating first. And I think that this is an important piece of advice for young players. Segovia famously said to composers, when he was older, "Oh, just send me your piece, and I'll fix it." He said that to Joaquin Nin-Culmel, who was affected very negatively by this idea. He said, what composer would accept that? You know, you write your beautiful music, and then they just change it, say, here it is. And actually, I really think that that method often doesn't work well, especially for a composer who has an individual language, because it's extremely hard for them to know in advance how things are really going to fit. And often they have to solve very serious problems in terms of making their language fit on the guitar. So let's look at this example from Sea Voyage. I will give you one example involving harmony and one involving melody and texture. On the screen in the continuous music in large note heads is what was eventually published. But the small note heads, the ossia staves, show you what was originally written. So the first thing that happens is that she writes this harmony. I'll try that again. Now, clearly there's not a lot wrong with that, so one of the things that might be interesting to discuss, whether it was really appropriate of me to question it. But I did question it for two reasons. First of all, on a good day, I can play. But it's risky. And then to go to here, these are beautiful glowing harmonies, I think. But my first question to Roxanna was, how important is it to you that people with small hands can play your piece? Because it's extremely difficult for me to get onto this. And she said, it's extremely important to me that this piece is available to as many players as possible. I also asked her, and this would be an easy discussion to follow if you saw the whole piece, to what extent she wants her piece to be the kind of piece that only a few people can play. And again, she was very clear that she wanted the piece to find a wide community of guitarists and to be played a lot. So I suggested to her that the piece contained what I often call the fatal accumulation of small difficulties, right? I can do this, oh, I can just about do that, oh, this is possible, yeah, if I practice this bit, I can do that. Next thing you know, the whole piece consists of such moments, right? And such pieces never come off in concert. So that was one problem, was the fact that some of these chords are very hard to reach. But there's a deeper problem, I think, which is that I asked her if when she was writing this at the piano, did she have the pedal down so that there is a wash of sonority always? And she said, yes, absolutely. Well, you can see that in this boxed chord here, is my mouse actually doing it? Yeah, this one here. Is the same as this box chord here, only a third lower. So this chord here is a minor third higher. So what she was getting on the piano was, a glowing, this beautiful glowing harmony, followed by. But what comes out, as you heard when I play it, is. There are other ways of doing it, I know, but losing the and then the resonance comes back. Bear in mind that this music is used many times in the piece, and so these chords crop up in different contexts, always with the resonance. So I suggested to her that we should try to revoice the chords so that they naturally resonate, that they're available to small hands, and that they work in all the different sections of the piece. So for what I came up with was that this box chord, we just move the B up an octave. And then when we get to here, the chord is again, the new voicing of the chord transposes. And the point is that this is always there. And of course, it was a matter of checking through the whole piece to see whether this solution was possible throughout. So we had a conversation about it. Obviously, it's not the same voicing, and arguably not quite as distinctive as the chord that she wrote originally. So of course, ultimately, it was her choice, and she chose the revision. Admittedly, as a guitarist, you can be very persuasive if you want to be, and Segovia knew this trick. And even more, Julian Bream. I once asked Richard Rodney Bennett what it was like to work with Julian Bream, and he said, I was afraid of him. He was further on in his career, and it was very important to write this music for him. In the cadenza of the guitar concerto, he wanted to add some rasguiados, and I said no, but he did them anyway. But usually the situation is the reverse, right? The composer is older, more powerful, and seems to know everything about music. And you may feel that you just have to play every note the way they wrote it, rather than engage in a collaboration. Let me give you an example from Panufnik's piece that involves melody. We go to India. There are a lot of different things in this piece. This passage is strongly imitative of an Indian ensemble with the tanpura. And then I actually don't know how you describe it, but when they strum the high-pitched strings, like that, and then a sung or melody or a sorod with lots of sliding in it. Now, the original version of this section had the melody an octave higher. We actually added the word sorod after putting it down an octave. So originally we had this. There was a lot of optimism here that these notes could be played as harmonics. That's how they originally were. And then now it carries on. And what sometimes happens, as you could hear in this passage, is that it's not always possible to maintain the resonance. Because when we go up here, you get that unfortunate effect, which should just be passively brushing the strings. And there was another thing too, which is that, well, actually, I'll come to that. Let me just play for you the revision, which was to always have the melody in the middle so that this resonance is available, but also you have available other you have a much greater range of resonances available. And then within that, we use the Miguel Llobet cello effect. Now, there were a couple of things about this. One is that it was very, very important to Roxanna that you hear a lot of this low fifth. So originally, when I suggested this idea, we went up the fourth string immediately, like this. she said, oh no, I have to hear the low fifth, that's the whole point. So we had to stay in this position. And then it's possible to move. Now I want to emphasize that, of course, Roxanna didn't know that this resource is available on the guitar. She had already written a singing passage with the melody and the treble. Like that. So we already heard how lovely the guitar sounds up here. That melody is the Portuguese lullaby that, as you can see, is being used here. And if this was a piece for orchestra, you would imagine that as we go to each country, a different part of the orchestra presents the music, like a continuous suite. And that's what this piece was in a way lacking in certain places. So this was the suggestion that she was hoping for, but didn't know how to ask for. So I think a lot of what I'm talking about is helping composers find their voice on the guitar. And one of the things that's required is, I think, definitely a knowledge of the composer's music, but also just not being afraid to make suggestions, not being afraid to change things, and not being worried about the awful responsibility of changing something, particularly if it's a change that makes life easier for you. There's always the worry that there's a better guitarist out there who would do it just easily, and you're ruining the music for no purpose. In this respect, I found actually talking to Julian Breen very useful. Of course, we don't want composers to be afraid of us, but Julian Breen would often try things out in concert and only later tell the composer. He told me that with Michael Tippett's Blue Guitar, he performed it in America, gave the first performance, and felt himself that playing it live, the piece was a little too loose. So he then went to another city and tried removing an entire type of music from the fast movement. This is how he told it to me anyway. He said, then I tried removing some music, and then I called Michael. I said, I remember being very shocked by this story, that somebody would dare change so much in a piece without first asking the composer, and in public. I said, what on earth did he say? Well, he just said, how did it sound? And that, I'll leave it there. It's all about simply, how does it sound? Thank you so much. Are there any questions? There must be. So let me give you a moment to think of questions. Yes? When there is no composer to ask. Yeah. It's a very difficult topic because oh, yeah. Yeah, transcriptions, I think it's always very important to make your own. when it comes to, so I was talking to Lorenzo Micheli about this, and he said he's now at the point where he'll change little things in Ragondi, who knew the guitar better than anybody, but you know, at the same time, it's music personal for his hands and his kind of guitar. I'm very sympathetic, extremely sympathetic, honestly, to this way of working. I find that students are often very reluctant to change anything in the music. And I started by mentioning this new book that's come out. There is, in fact, a whole chapter entitled Unstable Texts. I chose the word unstable. It's not a normal English word, but to convey the idea that almost all the music we play as guitarists, there are things in the score that can be questioned, often just a matter of obvious mistakes that nonetheless many people are reluctant to correct. I wrote a few pages about Giuliani's Grand Sonata Eroica from that point of view, because I constantly hear it played with the misprints, if I may say so. But I also talk about playing Baroque guitar music on the modern guitar, about playing Spanish piano music, about how to approach pieces like Merz's Schubert pieces, and then the Segovia repertoire. And then we come to this in a later chapter. So I was once reading, if I can come at this, answer this question, give you one more answer, a little indirectly. There's a beautiful book about the teaching of the pianist Arthur Schnabel. And the question comes up about if you think there's something wrong in the music, you know, a Beethoven sonata, should you change it? And Schnabel said, it's better not to, unless it's something very obvious, because you don't want to make the change, and later on, when your understanding grows, discover you were wrong. I completely disagree with that. I prefer the attitude of Rainer Maria Rilke in his Letters to a Young Poet, who says to the aspiring young poet, don't listen to critics who are trying to help you shape your opinions, your taste. You know, that very, very common experience that young people have of absolutely loving something, a performer, a piece of music, a style, and an older, more powerful person says, oh, no, that's not good. That stuff, it's not worth it, not worth your time. And then, of course, as a young person, you're crushed, right? To be wrong like that. Rilke says, no, don't listen to that kind of criticism. Follow your passions, your enthusiasms. And then if in time you discover that, well, the poetry that you thought was so marvelous, you know, loses its value to you, and other kinds of things, perhaps more sophisticated, take its place. That's very natural. That's how it's supposed to work. You'll discover yourself when you're right, when you're wrong, but with your own authority. So, ideally, we would like to tell students who are not very advanced, oh no, you can't change anything, because very often they have ideas that are not good from our point of view. And then you hope that one day your students will become incredible artists who have incredible judgment. I'm not sure that you can't. The trouble is that you have to allow the younger people, when they're not so advanced, to experiment, to get things wrong, to do things you don't like, so that one day they will be able to develop their artistry in that respect. So does that kind of answer your question? Basically, I would encourage students to do it, especially in the abstract when I'm not the one who. Sometimes I find it painful in lessons, though. And I will give the student my opinion, but I try to give it gently and in a collaborative way, or often by giving a different suggestion rather than saying, oh, no, you can't do that.
Yes. I'm a composer, not a guitarist. I wanted to ask, when I collaborate with guitarists, I always have visions and stuff like that. How do I credit the work that the guitarist has done to have like this place to write only dedication, or do I have to write your vision now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Well, normally, one simply thanks the guitarist in a note on the score, you know, on an opening page. There might be a dedication, but of course you might want to dedicate your piece to someone else in a particular situation. To me, I think it's fine just to acknowledge the guitarist's work politely in an acknowledgement. It doesn't have to be also revised by, yeah. I often think the opposite about transcriptions, though. It kind of annoys me when people play a piece that has been transcribed many, many times, and it's really just the same transcription with a few changes, and then they say, oh, this is my transcription. As a scholar, or as something of a scholar anyway, you know, you wouldn't do that. It would perhaps be better to say transcribed after Targa, or after Segovia, and or transcribed by Segovia, revised by Leathwood or whatever. I often wish people would put that. I understand why they don't, because it's concert life and it's programs, but somehow I find something a little bit unsatisfactory about it, not entirely honest. Yes?
This is the question of the Segovia repertoire on set and the new versions, and people say, okay, now we have the manuscript and now we know what Ponce really wrote. How do you feel about that? Is because we don't know what happened in Segovia, and of course we know something about the letters still.
Yeah. Well, yes, so it took me a lot of pages to deal with this in the book. So yes. So, only $20. You can find out Amazon.it, Amazon.it. You can order it all through the post. Anyway, when I wrote about this, I wanted again to write in such a way that people feel encouraged to experiment and to change their mind and go through a process. So what I did was I took two extreme views and tried to explain the problems with each one. So one extreme view is to say the composer wrote a piece, collaborated with Segovia, and finally it was published with the composer's knowledge, with the composer's permission, and the composer's name, and that is the only possible version of a piece. So that would, for example, I believe, be the view of someone like the late Oscar Gilia, right? And then the opposite view often uses words like urtext, the original, and that concept is located in some original manuscript, some early manuscript of the piece. And some people, this is what the composer wanted, and everything in the Segovia edition is assumed to be added by Segovia in Segovia's personal style, and therefore doesn't apply to us. And one example of a guitarist who I think has amazing success in taking that as a premise would be Tilman Hopstock with his beautiful recordings of Ponce, Turina, and so on, always from the manuscripts. Indeed, his edition of Ponce has the word urtext on the front. So obviously, you can probably tell that I believe that both approaches can result in artistically unforgettable performances, which is the important thing, surely. However, I don't agree with either extreme, that either extreme view is the right view. And I don't think that it's appropriate to use a word like urtext or original when referring to these manuscripts. I don't think that there is an original. I don't think that it exists. If you think about Param Vir, the example I gave you earlier on, here on the top staff, this is not, the top staff, A, is not the original. It's not the urtext. It's something the composer brought for discussion. So I was always afraid that somebody would find the manuscript and say, oh, he originally wrote this, and then Leathwood changed it. No, we stayed up all night, we worked hard, we tried things. He asked for things, he said, have you got this note, have you got that note? And and sure, it has someone else would have done it differently. So I am involved, but it's inevitable. And I think that there is a great distrust in late romantic sensibility that people of my generation inherited, which is to be suspicious of the work of two people, right? Something about the culture I grew up in led me to believe that there's no such thing as a great piece of music composed by two people together. It's always the solitary artist receiving this divine inspiration, and they write it down, and then even if you ask the composer, oh, could I do this, could I do that? Already something is lost, right? Composers who have a very strongly puritanical late romantic attitude don't even believe the composer when the composer says something is all right and it's contrary to the score. So I think we have these different versions. When I find myself being very suspicious of Segovia's work and wanting to reject it, I first ask myself, is this just my late romantic sensibility that I grew up with that I find very hard to let go of? Perhaps there are actually some beautiful things in this music. Personally, that's how I feel about the preludes. I just enjoy them more in Segovia's versions, the ones that we have. On the other hand, sometimes I look at a score by, let's say, Turina, and the first thing that strikes me is how much easier it is to see the music in the manuscripts with the long slurs, often particular voicings. The Segovia versions are not so different, but often in a way that is, it's still often very helpful to observe and perform the differences. So this is a way of saying that I try to acknowledge that neither extreme view is, in my view, really intellectually supportable. I try and explain that in the book. And then I believe that opens up a space for the very scary thing of exercising our judgment. And I would encourage students and performers to play what pleases them the most. Because this is well-known music, and you know, if you really believe that you should play not only Segovia's versions, say, but even a mixture of the manuscript, Segovia's ideas, and then maybe even some new ideas of your own, it tends to happen a lot nowadays. Although some people strongly disagree with that approach, there's always someone else that will play the piece. It's not hard for an audience to go to find another version of the piece. So I very much encourage people to experiment, and I would love to talk, yeah.
But that needs a certain experience.
It does.
So it's not just you change, you do your own version, but for that you need to know the style, study the composer, know the style.
I could not agree more. I could not agree more. And it's like even having the right to discuss this passage, it was very helpful that I knew his operas, knew the octatonic collections, had them under my fingers. The work can be better or worse, but then again, I would still come back to Rilke and his suggestion that it's better to get started, to really enter with a good heart into this process of trying to understand the manuscripts and the versions and start to revise, and you'll get better at it. And the results might be painful at first and perhaps irresponsible, and perhaps in a way they don't honor the music or the composer, but we all have to start somewhere. And I think perhaps it's better, I mean, I don't know, what I find with many students is that even just the work of looking at the manuscript, looking at the edition, is hard work for many, many students. So often in my own program in Denver, I set this as homework. I have a class and we do all kinds of different things. A lot of what we do is in the book, actually. And I ask students to present on, say, Mompo, Suite Compostelana, Turina Sonata, Ponce, Theme Variations and Finale, and so on, Villalobos Studies. And I ask them to simply share with the class what are the differences that struck them as most important and interesting. I find that that is a difficult task for many students. They often pick on things that are not so dramatic. So they might mention in the Villalobos studies that there are no repeats in study number 1 in the 1928 manuscript, but not notice that study number 10 has an entire extra page in it, which is, in my view, one of the most beautiful passages of guitar music ever written. worth noticing, right? And so that's another reason to ask students to really start early, but perhaps they have to start with the facts by being able to compile a list of the differences and being able to play them. The final point I'd make, I think the way I end that chapter on unstable texts is by listing all of the skills that a guitarist needs to be able to do this kind of work. And the first skill is to be able to read well at the guitar, to be able to take a piano score and just immediately create a rough and ready transcription that you'll refine later on, to be able to transpose fairly well, to be able to read unclear manuscripts with scribbles and things. All of these things require a surprising amount of practice and experience from young guitarists. So that's one of the reasons why I wrote that chapter, just to draw attention to those things. It was a very lengthy answer.
I have another question.
Yes.
It was about something you mentioned earlier on that feature that didn't sound so well in the guitar, and after a certain point.
Yeah, like the chord.
When you talk about the attack and sustain.
Oh, yes, yes, yes.
If you could point at when the guitar lost that fulliness from its sound, and then the recovery process.
Do you mean right at the beginning? Yes. So I think what I'd like to is just recap the argument very briefly. It's simply that on the guitar, it's possible to play 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes all at the same time, like this. It's possible to play them separately. And of course, it's also possible to play, so it's possible to write chordally on the guitar, like this. Where there's a lot of chords. It's also possible to write beautiful single lines on the guitar. And so on. But the guitar can only take so much of one note at a time or several notes at a time. And what really helps is to include moments where we pluck something, it sustains, and something is added to it. So, I mean, a big part of my teaching is drawing students' attention to this. Like if they play a suspension, and then as the dissonance comes, to really listen to the sound you make. And then you could emphasize the fact that I've added dissonant notes, or I could let this note bloom. And very often I'll use a certain amount of timing. So in those moments, what I'm doing is I'm making sure that the note that rings is not drowned out, is not overwhelmed by the new notes that are plucked. It's like if you play okay, so that's what I don't want to do, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to make a singing sound on every single note. But when I only sing on the melody, what happens is that as the melody notes are sounded, you actually can hear the decay of the note while other notes are being sounded. And this is my favorite thing to hear on the guitar, is the sound of a note going like this against other notes, but in such a way that I hear the effect. Ta-da. creating other layers, right? The bass. So immediately, when we are very sensitive to how things ring, especially the long notes, and other things kind of come into conversation with them, the guitar sounds less noisy, less complicated, less percussive. And so I connect that with also the advice given to composers, right? To actually create those possibilities for guitarists where they can listen and sensitively create resonances against one another. Does that answer your question?